we're going to do right now is the final timeline. I don't know what number it is. I think it's 15. Just write final number 1. All right. And for your actual timeline line, you know when this timeline ends. When does this timeline end?
1815.
1815. That's the breaking point. 1815. We're going to start in 1400, and you can draw 1500 pretty close to 1400. There's not a lot that happens in the 1400s we care about. So after 1500s, evenly spaced somewhat, the 1600s and the 1700s. Now, if we had to pick a cluster for the entire first half of European history, you already know what is it?
Feudal system.
The feudal system. Draw it up in your clusters blocks. The feudal system. Okay? The destruction, the dismantling of the entire feudal system. That's what everything we're doing is ultimately working towards. If you had to pick one other one to put up in our key clusters blocks, I would pick humanism. I would pick humanism. I think most of the stuff revolves around that. Now, our first era. Our first era is the Renaissance. Write this stuff real small. This is going to fit real tightly in this timeline. First up is the Renaissance, 1400s to 1600s. Okay? Throughout most of the 1500s. That's our Renaissance. Now, the first part of the Renaissance, I will say the Renaissance is split. There's no exact split. I usually say it's around 1500 or later. But the first-ish part of the Renaissance is called either the early, I spelled early wrong, E-A-R-L, early Renaissance, or the what? Italian Renaissance. If we had to cut this down to key concepts, what would we say? Number 1, we would rewrite humanism. Very good.
Faith to reason.
Nope, not faith to reason, just humanism. Now, under humanism is the most important motion. The most important thing that humanism causes the Renaissance to dismantle this feudal system is it's never challenging the status quo. Throw that line out. Challenging the status quo is reflected by this destroying the feudal system. It's a better key concept representation. It is secularism. Perhaps the number one thing that defines the old Europe before the Renaissance to the late Europe is the role of the church, especially the Catholic Church, in the lives of the people and the government. Secularism is going to break against that. Now, if you pick any leader in European history, you're going to say he is either or she is either blank or blank. Machiavellian or not Machiavellian. Okay. Okay. Machiavellian, if you just have that word down, you're going to remember the allegory of the smart and cunning fox and the strong and powerful lion, right? You need to be both to be a good leader. You're also going to remember the title virtue, right? Virtue, the ability of an individual to affect the world around them. And the last one, why can Leonardo da Vinci paint a Vitruvian Man showing humanism? Why can Michelangelo sculpt David? Why can he paint the top of the Sistine Chapel? Patronage. Okay? Now, eventually the Renaissance shifts. It leaves Italy and it moves to the late Renaissance or the Northern Renaissance. And there's one key difference. Instead of going full secularism, they combine it a little bit with religious principles and we end up with Christian humanism. Christian humanism. Okay? We end up with people like Mirandola, right? Free will. Thomas More and Utopia. Stuff like that. So that's the Renaissance. Next up, we'll do the Reformation. And we can actually pick the exact starting date of the Reformation. It was? 1517. 1517, we have the Reformation. Reformation is usually all the 1500s. It ends-ish around the 1600s. That's our Reformation. And even the Reformation we can split into two places. Okay? The Protestant Reformation. All right? That is Martin Luther. Okay, that's Martin Luther. And what did Martin Luther complain about in his 95 Theses? Be careful, you're going to be wrong. Not indulgences, that's small. Not simony, that's small. Not nepotism, that's small. Not pluralism, that's small. He complained about the role of the clergy, and that is anti-clericalism. Think cleric, clergy, anti-cleric. Anti-clericalism. Under that, if we were doing a full timeline, we would write nepotism, we would write simony, we would write indulgences, we would write pluralism. Know what all those are and be able to list them. The second part of the Reformation was the Catholic Reformation. And that's defined in the middle 1500s because the Catholic Church finally realizes we're losing 30% of our members. Everybody is leaving, so what do they need to do? The Council of Trent. Pope Paul III, they sat down and they reformed the church. They ended many of the abuses of the clergy, and they reaffirm some traditional Christian movements. Stuff like we still have 7 sacraments, right? The Eucharist is still transubstantiation. I do add, because they haven't been on a test in a while, even though this is a small key concept, I think the Jesuits might come up. Ignatius Loyola, right? They're the new clergy. They represent them. Instead of buying and selling indulgences and buying and selling people into the church, they meditate. They spiritual exercises, right? They grow a personal connection with God, and eventually they start to evangelicize, right? They leave Europe and try to get more people to the Roman Catholic Church. Now, even though she's not really Reformation, I always put whom right here? Elizabeth.
Oh my God.
Elizabeth the First. Elizabeth the First. Okay? If you remember her in the Reformation, besides the fact that she's actually in that era, you remember her problems. Not only was she a woman, which she solved that problem by becoming the Virgin Queen, who never marries, she also has to deal with a Protestant-Catholic divide in our country. Started because Henry VIII split with the Roman Catholic Church, so we have Anglicans and Catholics. She just says, stop it! I don't care what religion you are, it doesn't matter. And after that, when you picture Elizabeth I, you're going to picture the picture of her, right? Very white skin, very red hair. She's sitting there, her hand is on the globe. There's no king wearing the crown behind her, and behind her, over her shoulders, are the windows, right, that show out to what? The Spanish Armada of 1588. And you'll remember when we talk about exploration, the Spanish are dropping, and the English is rising to power. Okay, she is 1588. I would remember 1603 if you can. She dies in 1603. Her rule ends there. That's an important era. Now, next up is exploration. This is the only one at the top left, so you can draw it a little higher up. Let's do exploration. It starts really in the 1400s and goes certainly into the 1600s, maybe even farther. Now, especially in exploration early on. Who defines exploration early on? Prince Henry the Navigator.
For Portugal.
Yes, Henry the Navigator of Portugal in the 1400s. That's why Portugal's the leader. He doesn't navigate anywhere, but he finances all of these expeditions. Now, because he puts a lot of money into the hands of early explorers, Portugal is able to develop what for the rest of the world?
Caramel.
What?
Caramel.
Technology. Technology, such as the caravel, such as the latine rig, the stern post rudder. We also have the magnetic compass and maps. We also have the astrolabe. If you need to know those, go back and watch my exploration timeline. But we move on, right? The biggest thing as the other countries get involved, Spain, then England, then France, or Spain, Portugal, Spain,
Dutch.
the Dutch, then England and France. What's the biggest impact on the world of European exploration?
Exploitation.
Trade moves from the Atlantic, trade moves from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, the center of trade. The Atlantic becomes the center of trade. Okay? Now, when you remember, or when you think about trade moving to Atlantic, and you think about the Atlantic trade, what do you remember? Columbian Exchange. Columbian Exchange is the exchange of goods between the old world and the new. Most famously, what comes from the new world to the old? Diseases, smallpox.
It goes
Europe to America, diseases, smallpox, which aids in the conquest of the native peoples. Most famously, what comes from America, the new world, to Europe, the old world? I'd pick two. Actually, I'd pick 3. We always think of corn, which is fine, but what food has a bigger impact? Food. Potatoes. I always use potatoes because you know that they are so nutritious and so world-changing that countries all over the world, most notably Ireland, can rely entirely on it. You remember it because once the potatoes get sick, they go through a major famine and millions die. The other crop that I remember is what?
tobacco.
Not tobacco, but you're close. Not cotton, but you're close. It's a commercial good. It's sugar. Sugar is so much bigger than cotton or tobacco that you remember. Sugar leads us to remember what other fact about the Atlantic trade? Slaves. In America, you called it the triangle trade. You can use the same here, but slaves are brought to the New World. Initially, who are the slaves of the New World? The natives, the indigenous peoples, right? They work in the mines, they work in sugar especially, they eventually work in cotton and tobacco, but they die very quickly, so we replace them with African slaves. Now, the ultimate outcome of exploration is rivalry. right? Competition between these two. And that's going to be something that reflects during this entire timeline. The other big one is you can't have a brand new trade without the economy changing. What new economic system arises in the 1600s? Mercantilism. Mercantilism stays in place until the 1700 thinkers realize what's better. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, laissez-faire, free market. They all mean the same thing. And that stays in place until we get to the 1800s. In the 1800s, we move away from this, right? And we move instead to the social classes. We have the bourgeoisie up top, and then the proletariat down there. If you look with ration at this society, you realize that maybe free market isn't helping everybody. So we start something called what? It's called interventionalist. The biggest thing to remember is that we start to look at helping these lower classes because we realize, hey, you can leave these lower classes, but then they do nothing, they produce nothing. It actually hurts society. So instead, let's help them out. But back to mercantilism. The last thing I would put here is perhaps the biggest impact that the age of exploration has on destroying that feudal system. Ultimately, this triangle, this feudal system, is about a king, it's about nobles, and about clergy. The nuevo elite, or simply the new elite. The new elite in the rest of Europe, the new elite, guys, we also talked about them. You remember talking about them in the Renaissance? The patrons. Early art is all religious. Later on, we start to see more secular art. That's because these new elites, do you see how even though we studied them one chapter and then the next, they overlap? Okay? The new elites. Next up. The age, my favorite age, the age of reason. Now, the age of reason includes all the way back to the 1500s. This is going to take up the majority of the bottom middle. Leave a little bit of space on the bottom right, the French draft. The age of reason goes all the way into the 1700s. You can actually pick the exact end date of the age of reason. 1789. Okay? The age of reason will be split into two parts. The first part is what? Scientific revolution. And it takes a while, because not a lot of people can read, there's only elites writing, it takes a while. Towards the end, the second part is the Enlightenment. In reality, the Enlightenment does not really get rolling until the 1700s. But for the sake of space, let's just cut it in half. Okay? So, the scientific revolution was heavily about changing the way people think. And the best way to describe how we change the way people think is the entire age of reason is about changing the way people think. The best equation to describe that is what?
Faith and reason.
Faith. Faith is faith to reason. In the scientific revolution, what's the best way to describe that? Scientific method. Now, how did we apply the scientific method? We did it in two ways. The most famous one was what? Astronomy. Right? And you'll remember the famous astronomers, right? You'll remember the heliocentric model and Copernicus. You'll remember the telescope and Galileo and Jupiter's moons. You'll remember Kepler and the Rudolphine tables. They proved that orbits do not look like this. They look like this, right? Then the other way we looked at science and used the scientific method was on the human body. What do we call that?
Tumors.
Physicians. Physicians. These are a group of people that said, hey, the body is not really made up of four humors like that Greek guy Galen said. The body is, who's the most famous physician?
Bacon.
Harvey, who said the entire world is, the entire human body is circulation. Very good. We also had Vesalius, who started to map the human body. Now, it's kind of astronomy, but everybody, who's the greatest scientific of the scientific method? Newton. His ultimate laws of universal gravitation said, guys, what's out there in space is not special. We are not special. We are all one in the same. And finally, good synthesis, good connection, and really important. If you take the new elites, they had an impact on the scientific revolution too. Notice this is going on at the same time. New elites, secular princes, they became the patrons of these people. So put patronage. Remember Tycho Brahe, who's not a key concept, but his protege Kepler is getting money from I think it's the Danish king, Could be wrong, but he's not. He's getting money for the Danish king. Now, the second half of this, what happens eventually in the 1700s, is the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment is using the scientific method, but instead of applying it to the stars or to the human body, we apply it to what? Society and government. And the economy with physiocrats, but I'm trying to condense. So society and government, I think, will remember most of it. Now, if we look at people who look at the society, how society, that feudal system is set up. The most famous people to do this were from France, and they were called the philosophes. If you remember the word philosophe, then you'll remember the most famous one is Voltaire. Who's the targets of Voltaire? Everybody at the top of that pyramid. The king, the nobles, the clergy. Who else did we have? We had Rousseau, the guy who came late, was really crazy. We had Diderot, who wrote the most famous book of all time, the Encyclopédie. We also had people who analyzed the government. And these government people weren't just French, because in reality, who's the most famous of the government thinkers? It's up to debate, but I say John Locke. Because if you remember John Locke as a government thinker, what term are you going to remember? Social contract. And if you remember social contract, an agreement between the government and the people, you'll remember that the government's main role is to do what? Protect the natural rights or the general welfare of the people. And you get so many vocabularies. You'll also remember what French philosopher fits here. Montesquieu and the three branches of government. Now, the great thing about the Enlightenment, the thing that truly sets it different from the Renaissance or the scientific rev, is instead of just a couple people doing it, we had gone through a literacy explosion because now the printing press was more spread out, right? More people were literate. So they began to discuss. Regular people discuss the ideas in the Enlightenment. Where do they discuss these ideas? Salons. They read about them in newspapers and pamphlets. But besides salons, where else did they go to? Coffee houses. Guys, why do you think coffee houses became popular around this time?
Columbian Exchange.
Yeah. See how the Columbian Exchange is not long before this? All of this stuff. Now, the last thing I should say is we mentioned Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe latches on to the Enlightenment, but remember, Eastern Europe is always behind. They're always more feudal. They're less progressive than Western Europe. So even though they have enlightened people, they are in fact enlightened monarchs. Or enlightened despots, right? People who still rule as absolute power, but they try to change society a little bit. Now, next up. It's really the 1600s into the 1700s is, on that note, our age of absolutism. Now, who should you remember for the age of absolutism? Louis the XIV, Louis the 14th, and what other absolute monarch? Ooh, Peter the Great. By the way, quick timeline that I hope you remember for next time. I know dates are difficult to remember, but you'll always remember when the Reformation was, right? Because 1517, you know that, it's grilled into your brain. Elizabeth always comes up. You're going to remember she died in 1603 because you're going to remember, I think it's like 03 or early in the century, and you're going to remember that she had to be alive during the 1500s because she dealt with a lot of Protestant Catholic problems, okay? 100 years later, 1715-ish, that's the end of Louis XIV and Peter the Great, which makes sense for Louis XIV. Why? Because he dies, France goes downhill, and we end up with the French Revolution. 100 years later, 1815. It's not the death of, but that's the end of who? Napoleon. So 1603, early 1600s Elizabeth, early 1700s Louis XIV, and therefore Peter the Great. 1815 is Napoleon. Now, Louis XIV and Peter the Great, they became absolute monarchs. They centralized. Right? We use the triangle in a different way here. We use the triangle to represent government. They were now in control of everything. They didn't let who control anything? The nobles, right? Louis XIV built Versailles. Peter the Great built St. Petersburg in order to control the nobles. That's absolutism. What word really gets associated with Louis XIV? Divine right. Okay. Divine right. He actually revokes things like the Edict of Nantes to make sure Protestantism isn't legal. Okay. Now, to go back in time to our Reformation real quick, because I forgot one. In the middle of the 1500s, the biggest thing for the Reformation is some countries really had problems with it. What countries had problems with it? Anybody who used religion to rule. Who's the most famous country to use religion to rule? The Holy Roman Empire. They're in Central Europe, so they're really going to struggle with the Protestant Reformation. One big blow they had was there was a lot of scuffling and fighting in the 1500s while this was going on. No? So in 1555, the Habsburgs, to stop this, signed what? The Peace of Augsburg. Right? And that settled all the fighting down, but it made Protestantism legal, which really limited the power of the Habsburgs. 100 years later, we saw the biggest fight in the history of European religion, and that was the 30 Years' War. And in the middle, at the end of that, 1648, was the Peace of Westphalia. It was the end of the 30 Years' War. It made Protestantism finally and formally legitimate. It's not going anywhere. Okay? Now, back to absolutism. Also in this absolutism era is actually the opposite of absolutism. Instead of having individual rule completely, we limit his power. How do we limit it? Constitution. Constitutionalism. What country is most famous for constitutionalism? England, right? They were the most progressive, they were the most liberal, they were the ones who were going to stand up and stop it. Okay? Why did they fall into trouble here? Remember, Elizabeth now dies in 1603. What's the problem with Elizabeth dying? No heir. No heir. So, they end up calling the Stuarts in from Scotland. What are the Stuarts like? Jerks. They try to rule completely. We end up with an English civil war. In the middle of that, we had a crazy Protestant named Oliver Cromwell come to power. But in the end, England, being the most progressive and best country, decides to do what? The Glorious Revolution. They say, all right, it's not working. Bad people leave. Everybody else will just find a new king and queen. And that's what they do. So, next up is constitutionalism. Is instead of letting an absolute ruler take over like Louis XIV or Peter the Great, we still have a king, but they're limited by a document. It's a constitutional monarchy. It's what France is going to try to do. Now, after the Age of Exploration, we have the agricultural rev. Agricultural rev is 1600s. We can say the agricultural rev goes into the 1800s. And we can actually tell what goes on the right side. What's the endish of the agricultural rev? The industrial rev, right? So we have the agricultural revolution. All of the agricultural revolution is about this one main thing, and that is human geo. It's subsistence agriculture, where you grow food to feed your family, and we're moving to what? Commercial agriculture. What's one big reason people realize they can make money in commercial agriculture? Well, we had this Age of Exploration right here, right, where we did sugar and all this stuff. Let's bring that idea back to Europe. Okay. We also had a big problem with the economy because of exploration. Do you remember the price revolution? Spain finds all of this gold, crashes the economy, so we're in flux. What is the biggest thing Europe does to move to commercial agriculture? Enclosure. Who buys all the farms? The elites. We're the nobles, right? So we have this enclosure. The elites are now in control. The poor people get screwed over. They end up losing their jobs. They certainly end up, they don't no longer make goods. Now they work for wages and they went to the countryside. That's called proletarianization. Proletarianization. Now, as this is happening, we know that we're eventually moving to what? Urbanization, where they move to the cities, right? But before that, we had the cottage industry. Remember that? Anyway, with urbanization, we had problems with urbanization, right? Or just do a front face. We had problems, right? Do you remember what those were? Sewage, sanitation, crime, overcrowding, all that other junk. Go right here. Okay? But with urbanization, with this transition to the Industrial Revolution, now that people earn wages, we are no longer in a trade or barter economy. What are we? Commercial. Because of wages, that means we're buying stuff. So it's called the Commercial Revolution. Now, one thing that I didn't know where to put, so let's put it in agricultural rev, is before they all moved to the urban cities, we have this communal life. Communal life. Okay? People got together. Where did they get together? Carnivals. festivals. What was the infant mortality rate doing? Dropping. So what was the population doing? Rising. Very good. Okay? Now our last era that I'll try to get done is, of course, the French Rev. And the French Rev, if we look at only the key concepts in really, really brief, we can split it from 1789 to 1815, we can split it into 3 eras. First up is the Liberal Revolution, then is the Radical Revolution, and then finally is Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay? Now, before we even do liberal, what are the causes of the French Rev? There's 2. What's the long-term cause of the French Rev? Look at your cluster. The estates. Very good. It's really just the feudal system, but we can be more specific and call them estates in France. What's the other reason? Look at our map here, guys. We saw exploration. We saw Louis XIV rise to power. Louis XIV dies in 1715, so France is going downhill. What's a big sign that France is going downhill in the 1700s? Remember the 7 Years' War? So debt. Okay? Now, for that reason, the people rise up against the old Bourbons, and we have the Liberal Revolution. There are only 2 documents you really need to know. The first document is, what kind of government are we trying to get? Constitution. This is called the Constitution of 1791, but it's really the main constitution that you need to know. The other document, the most important document, the most enlightened document ever made, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man, where they outlined what? What kind of rights are they? Natural rights. As America said, inalienable rights. But the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So French people, or an English guy came up with the natural rights. French people make it popular in the Enlightenment. America uses it in the Declaration of Independence. And then France uses it in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But then things happen slowly. So we end up in the radical phase. That's Robespierre. That's the Committee of Public Safety. What's the key concept for the radical phase? The Reign of Terror. They chop off the head of the king. Robespierre's in charge. But that's relatively short, right? Because eventually we go through some other governments, but we end up with Napoleon Bonaparte. There are a lot of key concepts for Napoleon Bonaparte. Go back and watch that timeline. But the end of all of this is what? Coalition. The Congress of Vienna. You're not crazy with the coalition, the Holy Alliance, the Congress system, squashing liberalism. But Congress of Vienna ends it all. Thank you.